Hello and welcome to Setting the Stage, Episode 3, Edwin and Marwoleth.
Let's get started. So today I'm talking to Edwin, and you want to give a short introduction for yourself first?
Yeah. My name is Edwin. I, I'm 25 here in the United States. Big ol' uh state of Texas, all the way down south.
Yep, big.
Um, I'm fairly new to D&D. In the grand scheme of things, I started about give or take about like 2 years ago. Um, I It's a bit of an interesting thing. I have, at this point, I think I have more of an experience being a DM than I have an actual experience being a player. Um, yeah, and I just, and I've always liked writing stories, but I never really had a medium to do so until now. So now
Hmm.
it's the one thing that I find myself doing almost every single day. I,
Cool.
yeah, I'm a cat dad. I have two cats. Just here vibing with me. They might come around and rub up on the microphone, so I hope that's not too much of a problem every
Well,
now and
if it's cute, we'll leave it in. If
then.
not, then we'll edit around it. So not an issue.
Cool.
Um, what do you do for like work or school outside of D&D?
At the moment, just retail. Been doing retail for the last couple of years, just a little bit of everything.
Hmm.
Um, my latest adventure is being a cart pusher. So, working outside, pushing like 20 to 30 pounds of metal uphill 9 hours a day. Real fun stuff. Arguably one of the easiest things to do in the retail industry, as hard as it sounds.
Well, yeah, no customer interaction
Yeah,
or
no, you
limited
don't have to deal
amounts.
with money, no inventory, no nothing. It's just you set at earbuds and you just do it until you have to clock out.
Yep.
Yep. Um,
Unless it's rainy or sunny, then it sucks.
yeah, I'd much prefer it to be rainy than sunny though, especially down here. It's it gets so bad that sometimes the ground where like little like parking lot islands sometimes catch on fire. But
Ooh.
that's it only lasts for about like a good 2 3 months maybe.
Yeah.
But then again, it's Texas. Texas is bipolar. Um, but yeah, no, I am other than D&D, one of my other hobbies is trying to get into voiceover. So hopefully trying to find something better that will help me uh, you know, get a little bit more money, get some better equipment, start auditioning for a couple other
Yeah.
things here and
Yeah.
there. Um, but yeah, I don't get up to much. The most interesting part of me is that I'm the one who's trying to world build everything that I've created so far. Um,
Okay, cool. So let's get into how did you get started with D&D? Did you get started as a player or a DM? What brought you into the game?
I did get started as a player. Um, this was early February or March of 2020. Um,
Hmm.
I have a friend of mine that I've known ever since high school, and it wasn't until after we graduated and started looking into things that we were like, this actually sounds kind of fun. We might want to give it a try. And somewhere through the grapevine, he found a friend of his that knew a dungeon master that was looking for people to play with. And we were like, sure, why not? Like, let's just pick a time, pick a place. And we were lucky enough that it was an in-person game. That didn't come up until maybe later that summer. So
Hmm.
officially my actual first experience with D&D anything um, was me trying to study, quote unquote, and start watching Critical Role, um, which I assume is like the gateway drug for most people that do D&D.
Yeah, yeah, that's been a very popular way to get in
Uh-huh.
now. That and Stranger Things would be the two
Yeah.
big pop culture draws at this point.
Um, but I started watching that just to try and see, mostly just to understand how the mechanics worked, because I would try to like look at it. Um, I had bought the player's handbook, started reading through it, and it felt a little bit overwhelming. Um, Nothing too bad, but the after a couple of months, it was like, yeah, like we discovered how to do like character sheets and whatnot, and we started trying to brainstorm ridiculous ideas because we didn't know how things would work. Like for some reason, I thought it would be a great idea because my first character was a ranger, a beastmaster ranger.
Hmm.
Um, I thought it would be a great idea to have his, there's this whole backstory to him being like some sort of oracle that was raised at birth, like to serve like a cult dedicated to Tiamat or something. And one thing led to another, and it ended up being like, yeah, and he gets his eyes burned out or whatever. And I sent the backstory to my GM. Is like, well, that's great and all, and actually fits with the campaign and whatnot. But you said you're a ranger, right? I was like, yeah. It's like, well, you kind of need your eyes for ranged weapons, so we might need to rework that a bit. Especially since you're a new player, we don't want to get into too much homebrew stuff. So let's just try to keep it simple.
Oh man, when I first got into D&D, I was 10 and I had just been playing Pokemon and my dad told me about it. And I said, "Oh, I want to be a bat that can like cast spells." And that was not approved
Yeah.
for play. But yeah, we all have some crazy ideas when we first get into it, and then usually have to tamp it down to
Hmm.
something realistic or whatever works with the system that we're running with.
Yeah, of course. And also something to note that was, and I guess just for the sake of keeping things simple, he was running a module, which I think was if I'm not mistaken, the first module for 5e. Um, it's Horde of the Dragon Queen, I think.
I forget. Yeah,
Uh,
that was one of the early ones. Yeah.
mm. But yeah, we went and we were just trying to have this done, playing through it and whatnot. Meeting these most of these new people, that had connections to my other friend and whatnot. But um, one thing that kind of threw us off a tiny bit was just uh, how not so freeform it was, because the fact that it was a module, like most of it was just being read from a book.
Hmm.
Like there wasn't much. Uh, it felt kind of restrictive. Like it kind of almost seemed like, oh, you're playing a game and it feels open world, but like if you walk too far, the walls are invisible and like you can't walk past them. There's a certain point where you can't do anything.
Yeah.
Um, and again, like it's, and I've seen this a lot online and whatnot, but that's kind of the thing that a lot of people that end up watching like Critical Role and any other kind of stuff that's D&D based that end up doing that first and then trying to go into D&D, I kind of have the same experience, I assume. Um, where it's like, oh, it's not the same because it's not like, some grand, world where all this stuff is happening. It's just this one centered story and whatnot. And also, it just depends on, what DM wants to do like what style they have and whatnot. And
Yeah. For sure.
and it we kind of both like talked about it a bit, and we are like, it's not what we were expecting, and it's not bad, but it's not what we were looking for either. Like we were looking for something that was more like actual like role play and story oriented, and like trying to get the other players involved. Where on the other hand, the other players were mostly just looking to show up and hit things, and that's it. Just call it a day. It's like, okay, cool. That's everyone has their own style of play and whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Um,
you have railroading at the far end, and then like complete improv player
mhm.
directed stuff at the other end. So
Yeah,
yeah.
but um, yeah. Unfortunately, after a couple of months, that fell apart just because of scheduling conflicts and whatnot. That's
Yeah. That's typical.
that's usually what ends up happening. And we went on for a couple of months after that, just being like, like let's look at forums. Let's go visit, the D&D store we were playing at. Let's go to the bulletin board. Like maybe there are people that are looking for something, and we just I don't know. We never really got the courage to do anything else because we didn't know these people. We didn't really feel comfortable having anything like that because I didn't have any kind of like personal connection with them.
No, I've definitely
Um,
felt that way where I've had more fun playing with friends that don't usually play D&D
mhm,
than with strangers that do.
exactly. And then we definitely felt that after we tried because we didn't have any luck forming anything in person, so we went online and we
Mhm.
started trying to find stuff on Roll20, on just servers on Discord that were forming, under the banner of like, oh, we play D&D. If you want to join us, just hit the link and we'll be right here. Uh, Messed around with a really cool program called Tailspire. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. Um,
I know some. I've heard of it, but
mhm.
I don't know much about it. If you want to talk about it now a little bit.
Yeah, well, Tailspire is basically it's technically a game engine of sorts. It's available through Steam on PC. That if you're a DM, it basically lets you if people out there are familiar with Dwarven Forge tiles to actually create like
Hmm.
physical 3D renditions of a battle map that are, sometimes they're illuminated, sometimes they have like all these really cool effects to them. Imagine that, but in a 3D virtual space, where like you can create uh, anything. Like the maps can be as big as they want to, or as big as you want to, as long as your computer can handle it. Um, and you can like import minis. You can just use the ones that are there. Uh, you go through there's people that create maps in the community section where they've dedicated time to recreating entire uh, module stories. Like we were trying to play through Curse of Strahd at one point, and
Hmm.
it's really cool. But again, it all depends on if your computer can handle it because it's very graphic heavy. Um,
Oh yeah, I think I saw the initial release for this on Reddit where someone was doing an initial like alpha
mhm.
show off of it. So yeah, it's still in early access now. But yeah, no, yeah, I have seen this before.
It's pretty cool. But even then, it just didn't feel uh, it didn't feel right because again, it was just a whole bunch of strangers. Like it was a whole bunch of strangers that united under the banner of let's play D&D, but none of us knew anything about each other. Like we didn't talk outside of that. We just kind of showed up to session. You're like, hey, what are you? Oh, I'm a monk. Oh, I'm a cleric. Like, okay, cool. Um, and it just
Yeah.
it didn't vibe well with us, I guess, after a while, and we stopped and we got bummed. And we were real bummed out about it. And we were like, maybe we'll find something. We'll find something. And then eventually, my friend was like, well, why don't you try being a DM? I was like, well, I don't know what to tell you, my guy, but I have as much as experience as you do. I don't feel brave enough to do that at all yet. Maybe someday, because it sounds cool, but um, and I can. At the time, I was like, I can barely tell you what to do to roll a grapple check half the time. And you expect me to run a world? Like I just, um, but I was like, I'll keep it in the back burner and I'll consider it. And in secret, I started, typing some stuff up, coming up with like a potential pantheon, and I discovered a thing called Hero Forge, and that was that was my downfall and my demise because I've discovered that the way that I end up creating stories is that I make characters first.
Hmm.
I need to have a tangible representation of what they are and what they look like,
Yeah.
and then I'll give them meaning. And then with that meaning comes the story or whatever. Um, it's bad, and I think we were talking about it the other day, and I went about trying to ask, or no, he asked me what like how long have you been using Hero Forge? Like well, like ever since we started messing with D&D and whatnot. It's like so how many have you made? And I went back and counted, and it's somewhere in like the 500s kind of ballpark, I
Wow.
think.
That's
Um,
hard to keep track of,
y-
not just to me.
yeah, no, and it's you know, I uh I told him it's like, some people have a hobby, I have a problem. It's just that's that's the difference. But I can't. Like I can't stop because if I stop then the world stops,
Hmm.
essentially. And
Yeah, if
and
that's your creative process is just making a character and then in the background you're thinking about like an adventure, like I wouldn't say that's bad or a problem.
you know it just
It would be a problem if you were buying all these things off of
Oh
Airforge.
no, 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 no. I mean, if we had more in-person sessions, with the group that I currently have, I definitely would, because I would just, be buying the STL files and be printing those out like just 24 hours a day.
Oh, you have
Um,
a 3D printer as well?
yeah, well, it's currently in the process of being repaired, but it's pretty decent resin printer, which is nice. Um,
Oh, cool. I'd always imagined buying them for use in something like Tailspire,
yeah, yeah.
because you can
Um,
put the model into that as well.
they I actually haven't messed with that, and I'm not sure if the partnership is done yet. But I remember when they announced it, and that was uh that was a really cool announcement to actually have, because for a while people were essentially like modding their minis into it. Like they would download the STL, put it into Blender, redo the and all the different like connection points or whatever, and then like
Yeah.
input it into the game files themselves so that you could actually play it, which was, to me, that just sounds like a hell of a lot more work than I already have to deal with. But it was cool.
It's nice because they were set up as mods on the workshop.
Yeah,
I did it through Tabletop Simulator when I was trying that out.
yeah, that's right.
And yeah, it's nice. Other people did all this work for me, so I had I had a bunch of miniatures when I
Mhm.
was trying that out. I ended up not sticking with it. It wasn't something that worked for us. But
After that, and I had started just trying to make stuff, and uh, like I said earlier, I've always kind of had this like vague image of a world or a place, let's say. Um, but I never really had a medium to put it through, to actually like,
mhm.
a conduit to send it through to give it some sort of shape or form. Uh, and now that I had found, this system with fifth edition and whatnot, things slowly started to make more sense as I was trying to like put the pieces together here and there. And it was difficult because for me, like I'm very much a perfectionist, and that's probably the best and worst part about me. Um, because at even to this point, and I've already learned my lesson, and I've accepted it that I'm never going to be fully done with the world,
Mhm.
because you know real life is never fully done. If we stopped, then that would mean that progress is basically non-existent. Like there's always going to be something new, uh, you know, every day, let alone every other month or year. Like there's always something else coming out. Um,
Yeah, I think there are plenty of painters that I remember reading about where they basically would work on a painting until the patron who had like commissioned it just said, "Give it to me, I want it now," because they would never feel finished. They always wanted to like add a little bit more color here, or a little bit there, or another tree in the background or something
hmm
to really make it perfect. Just because it's hard, it's impossible to get everything in your mind onto paper or
Yeah,
canvas or whatever.
and but at the same time, I think it comes from a place of wanting to, like, I want to understand fully how this place works. Like I see it in my mind, but mechanically speaking, I I want to know how all the different like political systems work, and like how uh like the economy is affected throughout different places and whatnot. And I know that I'm definitely not smart enough to understand that in the real world, but I'd like to think that I understand it in my own world. So at least I
Yeah,
hope so.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and you can always come up with something else later on that
mhm.
explains something. Um, yeah, I feel like that's a balancing act. Like one of the things I have never wanted to include in my campaign is different currencies.
Yeah.
It's I feel like it can be a little bit interesting, but overall it doesn't add that much because the players have as much wealth as they have,
Mhm.
whether it's 5 gold coins from this country that are actually worth 10 gold coins in D&D money, or
Yeah.
if they just have 10 gold coins, like the players aren't going to view that differently.
Yeah,
So
no.
instead, it's just, yeah, you found this much money
You know,
and
that's
move on.
that's getting to me. That's a little bit too intricate, but because just like leaving things, leaving the basics of things as is that usually ends up working pretty well. Um, but I guess just trying to modify like the grand scheme of things outside of that, um, just to make it a little bit more unique is what matters most. Um, but um, anyway, to wrap up the 30-minute tangent, after a while, I had gotten interested in trying to get more embedded with voice work and voiceover, and I found a community somewhere almost about a year ago, and that's where I ended up getting my equipment, my microphone and whatnot, and we started getting together and started to like do different voice exercises and practice and improv and whatnot.
Hmm.
Um, and most of the people that were there were also basically coming together as a hey, I play D&D and I want to get better at improv, or I want to get better at portraying my character. Um, and also on the other half of that was like, hey, I'm a dungeon master and I want to get better at also portraying my characters to make it better for my players.
Right.
Uh, so seeing that as a common theme, the guy who was running it, his name was Dale. Um, he would be like, yeah, so let's run what I came to call like D&D light. Like there's no mechanics to it, there's nothing there, but you still roll a d20, and depending on how high or how low it is, the actions will follow through.
Okay.
But it's
Yeah.
mostly just there to be story driven. The numbers don't matter. Anything else doesn't really matter. And it was fun. Like, we got to experiment with, different people and different scenarios for like 30 minutes at a time, and then we would call it a day. And eventually, through just being active and whatnot, I got, promoted to a different role that would allow me to also start interacting with people.
Hmm.
And at that point, I would be like, yeah, well, Dale's a bit busy today. It looks like a lot of us are free. Does anybody want to go into the room and practice for a bit? And they'd be like, yeah, but we don't have anyone to, lead us. I was like, well, I guess I can try. I've been part of these enough to where I know how to run a couple of things. Um, and by then, like I said, it had been almost a year after since we've been messing with D&D and whatnot. So at that point, I felt well enough exposed to the material to understand like what checks to go with what actions, or what does this do that affects that, as far as like conditions or whatever, like this and that. So we went through it, and we had a couple of sessions here and there, and there were a couple of people that kept on coming back specifically, and at one point they all just kind of like came together and essentially formed like an intervention. They were like, hey, we really like the way that you uh, do stories and whatnot. Have you ever considered running a campaign? I was like, I don't know about that, but I will happily keep on running one shots because that's more self-contained. The continuity doesn't really matter. Um, it can be different characters, and if it is improv, uh, again, continuity doesn't really. It's not important. Um,
Hmm.
and that that felt like the safest way for me to interact with this because I didn't have to keep any notes. It was all mental in the moment. Um, for me, I at that point, or especially just for like one shots in general, I don't prep. I just run it off all in the moment. Um,
Wow. That's difficult to do.
yeah, but I for some reason, um, I don't know if it's just a fact of my brain being weird and the fact that um, I end up performing better if I procrastinate. Um, and in my mind, it's the same way because you're expected to deliver at that moment because people are waiting for it. Um, and I found that a lot of the stuff, like most of the stuff that's in my campaign now, was a result of stuff being mentioned in those one shots. um, to the point where, well, before we get too into it, um, those one shots ended up, you know, coming through like maybe like once or twice a week, and we would end up meeting, and they would eventually be like, hey, like, you know, maybe this is a good place to start a campaign. Like maybe we, like, you know, that you look like you have a good enough amount of information, and they didn't know that on my end I was trying to keep track of everything and essentially having everything that was being mentioned input into my own world as inspiration.
That, that's pretty cool. So it's
Um,
like you had an emergent campaign setting develop from
yeah,
all of these different little improv sessions.
and the good thing was that all these one shots were essentially, um, well, not essentially, they all the players that were there were playing the same characters over and over again through different scenarios. Um, and ideally enough, one of my players is she's a chronergy wizard, um,
Okay.
playing with the whole the idea behind time magic and dunamancy from Critical Role and whatnot. Um, and at one point
Right.
during one of the one shots, she had to leave, you know, in real life and couldn't be part of it for the entire thing. And I was like, okay, so in my mind, because everything has to make sense for some reason, um, I was like, okay, so there has to be a reason for her to disappear. I was like, okay, so you see her fade into like this, you know, haze of purple, and she's just gone. And you guys continue your trip, and it wasn't meant to be anything. And the next week we continued it because this one shot eventually ended up turning into like a five shot. Um, it
Right.
was like, oh, like she's back. It's like, how do we explain she's back? Like, okay, well, same thing that happened last time, just in reverse. she, she fades into existence because of weird time magic, uh, and that's where we're gonna keep it at. And through that same one shot, they were traversing through the desert trying to find some ancient temple that some unknown source had given them a map to try and find. Um, and they would eventually get there, you know, fight a couple of things, discover like different bits of lore that I had dropped that they didn't know belonged to my world.
Uh-huh.
And at the end of it, you know, they would come to find this basically this giant shadow eldritch horror entity thing. And essentially, long story short, through the end of it, through all these one shots, and you know, what they were all strangers to each other, and by the end of it, we all ended up becoming pretty close. Not just the characters, but the players themselves. And at that point, it
Yeah,
felt
that's
like a
great.
good point to actually, you know, go on and try to do something more with it. And they seemed like they kept on coming. It's like, you're really good at this, or at least we think you're really good at this. You should at least try. And the same thing I kept on doing is like, I'm considering it, but I don't feel like it's ready. I really don't. Um, when really looking back, like I had just enough to at least start it and at least give them a place to begin. And from there, I can continue building. Because, like, for me, it took me a while to understand and to really grasp the idea of, like, you don't have to have the answer to absolutely everything.
Hmm.
It feels nice to have it so that you're not scrambling in your notes and trying to look for something. That way it's, like, on you. And for me specifically, it feels great to, like, ask some obscure question, maybe, that, you know, the player might have just thought of, and then, like, without skipping a beat, you just have an answer for them because you know the world. Um, and
It
that's
is a nice feeling when you can do that,
yeah,
definitely.
and that's what I aspire to do at least at some point. And it is like that in certain aspects because not everything is done. Hell, not everything is technically created yet. There are like still blank spaces on the world map that I'm using because I'm not even sure what I want to put there. Um, but I just kept on telling him, it's like, you know, just give me some time, give me like another couple of weeks or so, and maybe we can start somewhere. And I didn't tell them, but essentially, we ended up gathering for another one shot, and they thought like, oh, we're just going to continue the story that we were already doing, which we technically were, and we began like right at the end of the last session,
Uh-huh.
and with that, the Chronergy players started to like fade out, like their vision started to black out, and it was from their perspective now instead of from the players, and then it all fades to black, and I had it so that she woke up on a ship in the campaign world, so that she's still the same character technically. Um,
Uh-huh.
and then from there, they just kept on going, and it created an interesting dynamic where technically she had been through all the no, all the previous lives or experiences, if you want to call it.
Uh-huh.
And now she's here with the same players and the same characters, but none of them know each other, technically. They have no reason to know each other because it's a different reality, let's say, because we were messing with, weird time, gravity,
Yeah,
reality thing.
of course.
And then it went on from there. Like, I essentially ended up using the one-shots and canonized them as different versions of the reality that they were currently playing in, which was cool. And I didn't expect to do that. I wasn't planning to actually follow through with any of that. Um, but so far, it's created a really cool experience for them, or at least they keep on coming back. So at least that tells me that they're enjoying it, or I must be doing
Yeah,
something right.
and that's cool. You can bring in like aspects of the different
Mm-hmm.
one shots you did, but without having to like worry yourself with like the sequence of them or which ones count as canon or something like that within
Yeah,
the campaign world.
exactly. And like
Yeah.
right now, they're they're essentially having a play-by-play, um, a replay of what they had in that session or in that five shot that happened, but it's happening in this world now from a different perspective. And now that everything's not being fully improvised and there's lore behind it and you know there's a rhyme and reason for things being where they are and why they were put there or what happened to them. Now they're actually having to like play through it and essentially having the weirdest case of deja vu, but experiencing it for the first time,
Mhm.
which is neat. Um, and what's cool is that we've been playing for about maybe 6 or 7 months now, and it's all online. Unfortunately, it's all been online so far through Discord, and through mere luck, everyone in my party happened to be traveling for some rhyme or reason, or at least most of them were.
Mhm.
And now, this next coming week of on the 19th on Wednesday, we're all going to meet to actually have an in-person session, which
Well,
is
you're all going to be in the same airport or something.
they're all coming down to Texas, and we're going to meet at one of the local D&D stores and just play our session all day long. Like we rented out the room to have all day there, and we're just gonna.
Awesome.
It's especially it's kind of fitting because it's kind of from a certain point it's kind of coming up to like the like the mid season finale of the story, if you will.
Mhm.
Um, so it's nice to actually have everyone here, and it's been a little bit more stressful because I'm here, trying to print out minis and have like a plan to have some sort of like physical battle map and whatnot. So, but other than that,
Right.
I mean, it's been really cool to try and prep and just work with all of that. Um, but yeah, no, we it's been a ride, and
Yeah, that sounds very exciting.
it's been both as much stressful as it's been fun because the fact that I don't I technically have a co-DM or a couple of them, but at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, it's just mostly me. Because again, it's they're their own people, they have their own lives. Uh, some of them are married and they have to take care of their wife and kids, and I don't blame them for that.
Rip.
Um, some people aren't as lucky to have as much free time as I tend to do. Um, but that means that I end up having most of my time having to think about where things are going to go, what they might meet. Um, you know, it just but most of the world building has ended up being me, and again, it's very fun to end up figuring out how everything works and essentially just giving myself a puzzle to work with because it's I've then I think this is as close as I've gotten to actually writing a story of sorts. Um, I've never actually tried to write anything down or make anything because it hasn't really been my interest up until now.
Yeah. Do you want to get into talking about your world now?
Sure, yeah.
All right. What's the name of it?
Yes. So the name of the world is Xetros.
So why don't you give me a physical description of Xetros, at least for the area that the players are usually traveling around in.
At the moment, they are in a continent that goes by the name of Marwoleth. Um, it is, for the most part, it has a pretty good general sprinkling of different societies and cultures and races and whatnot. But it has a couple of islands towards the north, uh, southeast of them. It's it's a pretty big place, and it's big enough to at least contain multiple kingdoms in it. Um, it is a place that's predominantly ruled by a kingdom of humans that uh, has a lot of strong feelings towards dragons and dragonkin, mostly because of historical reasons.
Okay. So you said like it's got a bunch of different areas, so it doesn't have like a specific tone to the land. It's all like there's mountains here, desert there, like
Yeah,
it's a bit of everything.
there's a towards the bottom of it, and there's a large section which might as well be a complete different continent um, of itself. And it's a place that's referred to as the Undying Lands, which is a nice little nod to Lord of the Rings.
Hmm.
Um, the language of the elders, they refer to it as Numorkal. It is a large, desolate area that, give or take about 1,000 years to the time prior, there was a great accident that um, the precursor race that existed there had a sort of temple slash base embedded into the center of this place. And an accident occurred, and what used to be a large jungle region was essentially nuked, for lack of a better word,
Uh,
and turned into a desert that hasn't recovered since. Um, and that's why it's slowly coming back up, and people are moving back into it and trying to repopulate it and give it purpose again. Uh, and that's why they call it the Undying Lands because it's a place that refuses to let life die, essentially. Um, Past that, it's blocked off by a mountain range known as the Carabrant Mountains, which cut through the entirety of that desert region, block it off, and then head northeast. There's a desert at the bottom. There's the main capital city, which is Azagan, which translates into essentially Giant Scar or Scar of Giants, depending on how you do it. There's the different city states of Brazaz and Karazhan, Mezar, Fakrunis, Korodil, and on top of that, there are the Karabrin Mountains with the two major Dwarven cities. There's Khazad Mord and Khazad Ras, which translate to the Green Gate and the Dead Gate. Those have their own Dwarven societies that live in there. They're different Dwarven clans and whatnot. Um, there is the Mirrored Mires of Tombscruff, which is essentially like a mix of like swamp badlands that would eventually end up uh, past that would maybe turn into like a really lowland sort of forest and hill kind of situation. Um,
Hmm.
Past that, towards the west, there's the Everheim Forest with the Zelen Grove and the Geld Woodlands and whatnot. Uh, there's Dratio, which is a large uh, sort of port city that revolves around being a highly uh, academic type of city. Um, they have close connections on the other side of the map towards the upper right, northeast of it, which is the Second Sky Academy. Um,
Okay.
that serves as essentially just take Hogwarts and throw it up into the sky. That was the whole premise of that.
A floating wizard school
Hmm.
city.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Uh,
have the same thing in my campaign.
oh well, there we go. um, at the very very top, there's the region known as Vasia, that's the name of the human kingdom. Let's run that. They
Okay.
essentially have domain over most of everything that's up north, up until you hit Dratio and before you hit the Second Sky Academy. Rodania, which is a slight nod to The Witcher, um, that would end up being the isolated island kingdom of the Dragonborn and Dragonkin, where they all
Okay.
kind of just go and try to find some sort of safe haven where they won't be hunted by the Vossian Empire. Um,
Okay, so
somewhere.
it looks kind of like you have different regions for different races with like a human empire and a dragonborn enclave, safe place, and
Mhm.
then I'm guessing the forests have elves in them and
Yes.
dwarves in the mountains,
Hmm.
something along those lines.
Yep. Just trying to
Okay.
keep it somewhat uh, to the general standard theme and whatnot. Uh,
Right.
and if you look down at the very, very bottom, towards the bottom left, there's that small sort of island atoll situation, Merriwick Bay.
Yep.
That was the starting point of the campaign. Um,
Okay. Yeah, yeah, you mentioned that. Yeah. Okay.
so, but yeah, that's essentially it. There's
All right,
a
so this seems pretty standard. Like you got the flying city, it's a little different,
uh,
and the giant scar is definitely a different thing going on here.
hmm
And the rest of it is, you know, we all use fantasy tropes.
yeah. um,
Um, so why don't you want to talk a little bit more about the giant scar? Like what happened there? I'm thinking the survey you mentioned there was some giant dragon civilization that had some sort of cataclysm.
the way that and I probably won't end up going too into it because I feel like my players might come and listen to this.
Yes, yes, that is an element of the
uh,
podcast, is you don't want to give away stuff that's going to come up later on,
yeah.
so you can't give all the details, but that's all right. We can leave
Um,
the audience wondering as well.
yeah, of course. But essentially, in this world, it's implied that, or at least from what's known at this point, is that the world was initially created for dragons, since uh, the first gods to come about after the initial singularity that essentially created the universe um, went about and trying to create children, and these children would become the gods of the current pantheon, which would end up being Tiamat, Bahamut, and a mix of others first.
Hmm.
Uh, they would go about to populate the world first, just essentially what we know to be the chromatic and metallic dragons of D&D. Um, and for a good while, it was kept like that until, for some reason, uh, whatever wave of gods came after the first birth decided to populate the world with a diversity of races, which at the moment is basically just uh, dwarves, or what are proto dwarves, proto humans, proto elves, and what a race of giants that are known as the Mayagao. the this race of giants they were highly intelligent. They're not akin to the giants that are uh, here today, like cloud giants and whatnot. They're descendants of them, but they were gifted with vast amounts of knowledge and just being able to understand how the arcane weave works. And they went about building an entire civilization throughout the entirety of the world itself. um, and there are, different continents and whatnot will have different uh, parts of their history and whatnot. But this is a race that would eventually end up trying to coexist with dragons that were there. Um, and also try to fight off the chromatics, which they didn't feel like they deserved to be there, since this world was initially created for the dragons. Um,
Okay.
and this race would go about and essentially create um, what is in current time, as far as what people can understand, because it's the the first or the quickest sort of analog to understand temples, sacred temples to the very first precursor god, or one of the first primordial gods, known as Friotos, which is believed to be the one who created the current pantheon. Um, they would follow him and essentially try and go forth and seek out knowledge and try to, understand and help the world through him. Like it's whatever, it gets a bit intricate. Uh, but here with the giant scar, again, what people perceived to be a temple to them is essentially it was an R&D facility. It was a place
Oh.
where they could go out. Well, back when before Numorkal was referred to what it is now, when it was the Zungali jungle, and it was basically an isolated rainforest region. That there was a kingdom there. There was a an established kingdom of Leonin that would rule over this place, among other creatures. But
Hmm.
they had a treaty where they could, settle there, and they wouldn't disturb them. Maybe even give them a couple things in return and whatnot. Just general standard trade. But essentially, what this was is that this was a place for them to experiment with different forms of magic and try to figure out how things worked. Like, as my players were just walking through this entire thing, they managed to find what is essentially like the different science labs that were embedded into this place. Uh, like there were things that were essentially referring to like mana redistribution and like manipulation, or like what's it? Chronal displacement chambers. There's a thing called the Faygate network, which implies that there's essentially like a Stargate, but it lets you traverse through different points of the planes, but through a connected cable network of Fey magic, essentially. Um,
Okay. Yeah. Little
there's
little Fey train station.
yeah, essentially. There's a whole bunch of stuff like they were trying to. Uh, One of the things they ended up discovering and fighting was essentially um, breaking it down is basically the physical manifestation of a silence spell, which is meant to be uh, a huge ooze that was able to like spread itself through a room and encompass it. And the idea is that once it feels something or someone enter the room, it closes off and it creates a soundproof barrier so that no verbal components can be like done. And it's literally immune to everything. So it's stuff like that. Like they were trying to like focus on stuff to like be like passive but still keep a sense of security. Um, and further into this temple, they would end up discovering that for the most part, the center of it, they were trying to collect this sort of uh, resource that would allow them to convert it into a power source. And this power source was being stored inside of a battery, essentially. This was a giant nuclear reactor for lack of a better term.
Okay.
That core was centered. It was dug into the earth, just for the sake of saving space, I would assume. Now, it's implied that, give or take about 1,000 years ago, in the current time of this game taking place, uh, there was an event that was simply referred to as the Great Cataclysm, where there was a chain of events of disasters that happened revolving around the Mayagao um, uh, race. And different things happened in different parts of the world, in different continents. But here, essentially what happened is that uh, the core um, started to malfunction for some reason. And all that energy that had been stored up just blew off. And it exploded.
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing the nuclear parallel. This sounds a lot like Chernobyl.
Mm-hmm. And whatever it was, or whatever amount of power they were storing there, was powerful enough to not only shatter the earth around it, but completely just decimate everyone and the entire continent, essentially. Like, you can even tell the mountain range was supposed to continue towards that edge, but there are those ones that are slightly darker and a bit more curved towards one side.
Hmm.
That's because of the blast radius managed to hit that side of the mountains, and it,
Okay,
it
so it's almost
wasn't.
like a crater caused by it. All right.
Yeah, like it wasn't enough to completely clear out the mountains, but it left them so that they're essentially like curved spikes that loom over the desert region. Um, and in the common tongue, Zunkarazan would essentially translate to the ribcage. That's what they colloquially know that city to be. Um, but the Zygon Kovu is both in that old tongue giant scar because of the way that it affected the earth around it, but also scar of giants, depending on how you translate it and your interpretation of the word, because it's
Hmm.
literally what it was.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. I can see the ambiguity there. That's cool.
but yeah, and after that happened, there's what was known as the 200-year period as the Age of Ash and Suffering, which was this giant, well, not giant. There's this huge war that was started by the dragons to try and uh, lay claim to the lands again and try to enslave the humanoid population. Because up to that point, the Mayagao were basically the only ones who were able to fight back against the chromatic dragons. They were the only ones just like who stood a chance against them. Now that they were gone, they took full advantage of that, and now was essentially these humanoid races, with some help of some metallic dragons, going up against most of the entire population of these chromatics. Um, After all that, they would end up winning in the end,
Hmm.
but certain things would happen. It's known that Bahamut in this case would essentially put a stop to it and be like, "Hey, everyone, time out, go to sleep, just everyone chill, like just stop it." Like that's what happened.
Right.
Uh,
Okay.
all the dragons would leave for a couple, like 400 to 500 years, and that would essentially give the people enough time to, like, regroup and repopulate and try to understand how to defend themselves. Um, After that time, the dragons would come out of their hibernation and see that essentially like the world is different now. The world's it's moved on without them, and now they're a lot more well equipped to defend themselves if need be. So both metallic and chromatic would essentially just end up polymorphing into humanoid species and embedding themselves into society. And some time would go by, and eventually some of them would come to form families. And at one point, some of them would have children. And unbeknownst to them, uh, even though they were human, or seemed human,
Hmm.
their aspects would be passed down just through mere genetics. and that's how Dragonborn were created in my world.
Okay, so it's kind of like how Celestials, the Ismars and Tieflings work
Yeah.
in the current
Mhm.
iteration, where it's like can be dormant and then it shows up.
Yeah, like it'll well, for the most part, like it's there from the beginning. Like they're born, and you can clearly tell that they
Uh-huh.
have like uh depending on what race it is too, because I've started to integrate the idea that every race have they had an interaction with a dragon. There's a sub race of dragonborn for specific races. Um, just because I felt like it felt uh right for what was happening with the lore there, and I just felt it would be interesting to actually implement that. Like there's a so far they've met essentially what the dwarven variant of a dragonborn would be, which is called a drunagar. And the drunagar are basically just if you take a kobold, make them stockier, a lot stronger and a lot stronger, more stronger. There we go.
Uh-huh.
And more intelligent, and able to actually like work a forge and stuff like that. Yeah, there's different versions of everything, and there's even uh, there's a difference between regular dragonborn, which is essentially what uh, humans and dragons would create, and then there's what um, there's a possibility of two dragons that when they get together in humanoid form, that their child will also be stuck in humanoid form
Oh,
without
okay.
being a
That's an
dragon.
interesting one.
Um, and at that point, they're referred to as pureblood dragons or Drakain. Um, there's literally no other noticeable difference at first glance between them and regular Dragonborn, other than the fact that they live up to sometimes up to 200 years old. So they'll age a bit differently. But other than that, it's essentially the same thing. Um, but having had the bad experiences they did during the war, and now that it's several generations later, and people don't really trust what these dragons would do or are capable of because of stories they've heard, uh, it essentially triggered the equivalent of a witch hunt in Marwoleth, where people trying to find these dragons that were hidden in society, and it created these things
Ah,
like, oh,
okay.
like if people were running for some sort of office to be some sort of like mayor or something, like, well, how do we know that this guy isn't a dragon? Like my opponent could be a dragon, and how are we going to trust him? Stuff like that. There's a lot of undeserving death and cruelty that went around towards dragonkind because of all um, the paranoia and superstitions behind it. Um, and that's what essentially ended up um, creating the reason for them to get out of there and move somewhere where they were going to be safe. Um, so the majority of them ended up retreating to Rodania, and they would be ruled over a gold and silver dragon that remain in humanoid form. Uh, Humanoid, as in they appear like a dragonborn. They're not fully human.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, that's essentially that. Um, that's how the history's been going so far. Like they most humanoid species, especially humans, period, tend not to have the greatest amount of trust towards Dragonborn. And the further in you go into the Vassian kingdom, the more dangerous it is to be a Dragonborn existing in that area. Because there are full on divisions within the Vassian army that are dedicated to hunt Dragonborn.
Okay.
Um,
That's pretty cool. I like that. It's usually Dragonborn are more considered like a good race, but in your campaign they're more like a untrusted pariah.
yeah, like, and it just makes it to be like an unfortunate situation because especially for the Metallics, because the Metallics were the ones that sided with the humans during the war, and they fought for them. A lot of them fell because of it, and now after all, like everything they've done, now they treat them like a monster, which I mean is technically kind of true in comparison, but
Hmm.
there's just not they didn't earn that trust from them, I suppose. And it makes living a lot harder for them. But that's the super condensed version of everything that's happened within the history of this place. Um, but to go back to the Scar, up to modern time, there's within that crater, which to put it into relative size, the hole itself is give or take about maybe like half a mile uh, in length, like the actual opening itself, and it goes about 2 miles deep. So about like twice the size of the Grand Canyon, essentially.
Okay.
Um, Within that, there's just like there's an entire city that's been established that lives underground within the walls of this place. Um, because this entire place has basically been turned into a somewhat of a mining settlement that the Vaskian Empire has jurisdiction over because of some treaties that have been done. Um, that leads me to another thing that's unique about my world. Um, is that in this world there are no health potions. There's no such thing as health elixirs. There's nothing. It's just magic. But in this place, there's and essentially the way it happened is that whenever I was trying to think of things to make unique in my world, I started with a real simple idea. It's like, well, what if instead of having liquid potions, instead of being liquid, why aren't they solid? Like the actual tangible things that you can handle.
Mm-hmm.
And that ended up going towards the creation of a this substance. It's called revivium, which is essentially these red gemstone crystals that grow in veins under the earth. And throughout history, throughout mining, people would discover them and run tests on them, and they discovered that this mineral had some sort of healing capability. Uh, Depending on the purity of it, is the strength of the potion, essentially. Um, and all you do is you hold it, and it's implied that it has like the slightest essence of sentience to it, because the
Hmm.
crystals they don't automatically activate when you grab it. You can hold it like in your hand and whatnot, but they won't work unless you have the intention to heal either you or someone else, which is a bit interesting. Um, and there's a whole reason behind that, but again, my players haven't gotten that far. That's going to be a sort of end game reveal type of thing. Um, but there's a whole reason as to why all of that exists within the world itself. Um, and this has essentially become a sort of uh, a very important resource that a lot of people want to have access to for commercial reasons, mostly. And because of the
Okay.
influence and power that the Vaskian Empire has, um, they've essentially seized control of just this city in the center and tried to overtake all the mining operations, which has essentially destroyed any kind of economic prosperity on their part. Because now instead of them being rich and trying to thrive off of it, now the empire is getting all the fun. Um, so that creates an interesting dilemma around there, and that's something that they had to deal with as they were walking by. Um, because actually, well, we haven't gotten to my players yet, but to go into the story of one of them,
Mm-hmm.
uh, he is the prince of the Rodanian kingdom. Um, so he is a dragonborn. He's a pureblood dragonborn.
Gotcha.
But uh, up to this point, he uh, he was born a gemstone dragonborn, a crystal gem.
Okay.
Uh,
Yeah.
which up to this point in history, as far as known history goes, gemstone dragons don't exist at all.
Okay, so he doesn't know like his
Um,
ancestry then?
yeah, no, he's anyone within his family or just him in general don't know about any of it. Like that, as far as everyone knows, he was the first one to be born like that, which was strange considering that both parents were metallic, and they took that as a sort of like religious sign that he was meant to be something more. You know,
Okay.
playing into the whole mechanic that crystal gem dragons are their main damage output is radiant damage. So he plays a light domain cleric and essentially goes on behalf of representing the kingdom and Bahamut and trying to form. Now that he's been born and is of age, he's going around the world trying to form diplomatic relations with people, trying to open up the borders of Rodania again so that they would be accepted in society again.
Okay,
Um,
that's a nice way of like having a more personal connection with the background of your story. That's
mhm.
good.
And it it definitely makes it uh, interesting because of the fact that he is a member of a royal family, which would have had, you know, great education and whatnot. So every single time there's like, oh, some sort of potential lore drop, and someone rolls low, and like, would I know this? Would in my studies would I have done? I was like, yeah, like, I mean, if it's anything dragon related, you basically have to give it to them because it wouldn't make sense to have someone who was born from dragon lineage to be like, you know what? No, you don't know this one thing. That's weird.
Okay, yeah, that's cool.
um, but yeah, no, like it's there's a whole bunch of little things here and there, but and as far as that's my long-winded explanation for why the scar exists.
Okay, all right. Touched on a lot of other stuff there,
Yeah,
so that's good.
I'm sorry.
Uh, why don't we talk about the hub for your campaign? So you mentioned a couple of different like different villains that had shown up. Why don't you talk about one or two of those?
So, Merrywick Bay is it ended up being the starting point, mostly because of just of how enclosed it was. It's
Okay, and that's that like set of islands that's off the coast on the far right,
yes,
the bottom right.
it's right towards the southeast of the Ganemian coast. Um,
Okay, got it.
they up to this point and for a long while, Merriwick Bay has been an independent place. They they don't fall under any kind of royal jurisdiction, so they are able to do and run as their own operation essentially. Uh, they serve as one of the major trading hubs of this side of the world, so it's a pretty important place. Um, it does look relatively small here, but just to give it a bit of scale, there are five different islands that form this sort of semicircular atoll formation.
Hmm.
Uh, each one, give or take, takes about a day to walk from one end to another. The the place itself is essentially run by a council representative of each island, and each island head does its own thing. They all provide their own resource. For example, the one towards the far right that kind of sticks out towards the top of the word bay, um, that is a place known as Crown's Ridge, which is essentially this mountainous region that is an island that has a volcano sitting on it that is inactive, thankfully. Uh, but because of the type of ground that it's on and in the volcanic activity that it has had, is a very fertile farming ground.
Okay,
Um,
yeah. Volcanic ash is very good for fertilizer.
mhm.
That makes sense.
And there's a family that took advantage of that one day and essentially took a fruit that was available towards the other end of the continent and brought it here as soon as the bay opened up and essentially ended up running a very successful wine business called the Crown's Jewel. Um, because the entire mountain range is referred to as the Crown. Um, So just stuff like that. Every island has their own thing that they give towards the island to benefit them and their economy. When
Okay.
they,
Yeah.
the reason for the players to starting there was, it wasn't meant to be like that, but uh, each one had a different reason in their backstory that just ended up making sense. Like for instance, um, the gemstone dragonborn, the cleric, he was out on a diplomatic mission, trying to reach out as many people as possible. It would make sense that he would start here, since it's a neutral territory that has no human influence or no Vossian influence.
Okay.
Um, our Chronergy wizard had the library that they grew up in destroyed by some mysterious pirate ship in the middle of the night. So they would go towards some sort of port city naturally. Um, there were two players that were born in Merrywick Bay. One of them returning, one of them they met there, and the other one was just really good at sailing and had a sailor background. So he just kind of tagged along on the boat ride.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, they all have a little connection to that space. That's
mhm.
cool.
um, so as the cleric prince was there to talk to the council that ran this place. At the same time, as luck would have it, the Prince of Vassia would end up coming around on the last leg of his tour to meet the empire that he was going to run and just be more familiar with the territories around Marwoleth. Um, and they would eventually end up having this meeting and talking about stuff, and it was it was nice because it seemed like they actually had a chance at trying to coexist because the cleric prince and the Vossian prince would actually have like good uh they hit it off pretty well and actually started to communicate, and there was hope at least that something good would come from it. During their time here, uh one of the players that was the players that they met there, at least one of them, is part of this sort of like secret assassin cult called the Crimson Glare, which um, they're a blood hunter organization that specializes in essentially blackmail and recon. Um, and since this is a large hub of trade, sometimes important people end up coming here. And what they would do is that they would send their agents to find these people, and the way that they operate, they have certain items that allow them to be, unseen or undetected for the most part, at least, with the common eye. And the way that they do their things is that they essentially stage their ambushes as vampire attacks to conceal their
Okay.
true stuff or
That's
their
clever.
true meaning. Because what they do is that they don't go out of their way to hurt the person. They try their best to remain unseen, but they have to gather blood. And the way they do that is that they use a syringe, or a syringe system that makes it look as if a vampire was the one that attacked them. And now they're
Yeah, the little
paranoid, trying to look for something that wasn't
two-pronged
it.
syringe thing.
Yeah. Um, but the reason why they collect blood is because um, there's the person who is the head leader of this organization. Um, essentially has a way to connect with the blood of these people, and and I can't say too much either because we haven't gotten to that part.
Oh, okay.
But uh, to break it down a bit, there's a way that these people can utilize the blood that they've collected to essentially scry on them without the person knowing. And they can intervene with their lives and blackmail them into doing stuff for them throughout the world and essentially control what they do and threaten
Okay.
them with, if they don't do this, then this will happen or whatever. That's
All right.
that's
Yeah.
all they do, and they're really good at it. And one of the players was trying to get out of this cult. They found the other group of people, tagged along with them, and ran away. Uh, that's one of the threats that is so far unknown to the people of Merrywick Bay so far. The other
Okay.
ones that they ran into was strangely enough, another cult of people that, um, up to this point in universe, they don't know their name, but they're technically part of a one shot that they all played, so they already know about it. It is
Okay.
a people that go by the name of the Shattered Ones, which they essentially just wear. They wear dark robes all the time to conceal the armor that they wear, which essentially looks like if you were to take like brass-ish gold armor and then
Hmm.
just like embed or glue like shards of a broken mirror on it. That's what the armor looks like.
Okay.
Uh, they remain them, anonymous with masks and whatnot, and their whole thing is that they believe, they strongly believe that before the pantheon was created, there and before the pantheon and before the primordials were created, there was what they considered to be a singularity, which was the amalgamation of all of that power. And
Okay.
there,
So you're using like the standard Dawn War Pantheon, so all of them combined together.
yeah, like they, um, throughout the beginning of the creation myth, essentially what happened is that it's believed that there was some sort of singularity that split into two for one reason or another. Those two would end up being the primordial gods that represented the good and the bad.
Okay.
The good would end up uh, breaking small chunks of his power off to essentially give birth to the current pantheon, or at least the current the good side of the pantheon.
Right.
And in an effort to not be outdone or be left behind, the other darker half would do the same thing. Um, and they take this whole uh, from a religious standpoint, they take that whole process as like him literally breaking pieces off of his soul
Okay.
to create these people, to embed them with whatever kind of godly power necessary to create the god he wanted.
Okay.
Um, that entire process was is named the Great Shattering. Uh,
And I'm guessing they want to put that primordial god back together.
they want to put everything back together because they believe that the world is broken and it needs to be repaired, and the only way to do that is to put it back to the thing, back to the way it was, essentially.
All right. So like malevolent Gnosticism.
Yeah, yeah. um, and that would require them trying to go about and uh, if you're familiar with bits of lore of Critical Role, there are these things called the vestiges of divergence, or if
Hmm.
on the other end, there's the arms of the betrayers, so both good and evil. There are magic items that represent each god and grant abilities and boons to the people that wield them. And essentially, at
Uh-huh.
that point, you become like the chosen warrior of them, or whatever. In this case, it's the same thing, but it's different. Whenever the birth of a god would happen, there would literally be a physical chunk that would form that was like this condensed mote of energy that would represent the god. And those chunks were just scattered throughout the material plane and all other planes of existence. Those would come to be known as the shards of creation. And with the other half, the spalls of rancor. And they both serve the same purpose. Whenever they're embedded into an item, you know, they turn it into some sort of weapon or armor or any kind of other magic item that grants them some sort of, essence of that god,
Okay. Yeah. Big, powerful artifact level item.
essentially. Um, but that's that. Like they're trying their best to basically put the gods back together. Um, and the way they're doing that is that they're trying to create all kinds of disarray and essentially renouncing all of the other gods that exist at the moment. So, um, cut back towards the very, very last session before they left the island. Um, the the Blood Hunter agent character that was trying to run away
Hmm.
was still like they still knew about him, but they essentially put a bounty on his head. And the bounty hunter decided to play with his mind a bit and be like, "Hey, do something for me." And if you do it right and it all goes well, I'll add a little bit of bonus time to your bounty, and I'll let you get a head start, just to kind of play with him a bit.
Okay.
And he did. And he's like, he went to a pickup point, found a small box, and he was like, "Okay, smuggle it onto this ship." Okay, and he did successfully. It was great. The whole meeting with the prince goes by. The ball does its thing. They all have a great time. They're like, "Oh yeah, like we'll probably end up calling a meeting once I get back to the kingdom, and we'll arrange some stuff to try and help your people and try to make things right." Prince gets back on a ship, and they start seeing him sail off, and all of a sudden there's an explosion that happens. And from that explosion, a dragon turtle comes out and just rips the ship apart. After the whole rescue operation happens to try to get whoever else was left, uh, the prince is gone, and the right hand of the prince is gone. And it's assumed that they're dead. And the person responsible for that was one of my players, through the work of the bounty hunter that's chasing him.
Okay.
So now there's the death of the prince, and literally right as that was happening, the other cult went about and basically set explosives on every single temple in these islands. Because again, since it's a port city, one, and it's neutral, two, so they allow a grand basically the entire selection of the pantheon to be inclusive to everyone.
Oh, I see.
And depending on what island you're on is the temple you'll find. Essentially what they did is that they went in and just, started attacking the priests and destroying the temples, and it happened in a way where it almost felt coordinated. And the players aren't sure if it's connected or not at this point.
Even though it's like one organization just wants
Yeah.
money and power, basically, another one wants to undo existence.
Mm-hmm. And then I think those were the three prime things that happened.
Yeah. And actually, it's about time to wrap up. We're running a little bit over.
Oh, damn.
Yeah. So is there any other? I think we already covered most of the things I wanted to interview about. Is there any like piece of advice you'd want to give to other DMs?
Piece of advice. Try your best to not stress yourself out, especially if you're trying to create your own world. Start small. Start very small. Because out of personal experience, if you're trying to create a world where your players will be able to run free, it's going to take them a while to get to everything that you've created. So just take your time developing a certain point, and don't try to worry too much about what's to come immediately after, because time will move a lot slower than you think.
Yep. Yeah.
You
The DMG gives that same advice where you're supposed to like develop something that's just like a 5 mile square
Yeah.
initially, just to have something there, and that's enough to get started.
And
That's good advice.
just just personally speaking, there will be times where you think you're not providing enough bits of story, or maybe your players are confused and generally don't know where to go, and you might think that's on you because you're the one who has the entire chunk of the story on your end. You know where the points connect. So if they do need some help, nudge them in the right direction. But just trust that you're doing okay. You're doing all right. And just let them have fun. They'll get it eventually.
All right, cool. Well, thanks a lot, Edwin.
Of course.
And yeah, looking forward to when it comes out.
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, so that'll be the end of the episode there.
Okay.
Is there anything you want to ask me now that we're at the end?
Uh, well, I guess like maybe just shoot back a couple of questions you gave me. I'm assuming, are you running a homebrew campaign?
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
My homebrew world is called Cimmeria, and it's about a couple of different. Like I wanted to use the Greek gods just because they felt more grounded to me.
Mm-hmm.
And Cimmeria is a fantasy region that the Greeks described, so it's reimagined an area around the Caspian to fit that.
Interesting.
And then that's got there was a evil dragon vampire empire that they overthrew recently in one of the campaigns, and now we're starting a new set of characters in that campaign, and they're playing a bunch of orcs now that are trying to unite the different orc tribes that have been on the fringes of society in the past. Kind of like the dragonborn, but a little bit less of a. There's differences obviously between what you did with your dragonborn and what's happening with the orcs in my campaign.
Yeah. Okay, so
yeah, so they're the good orcs, although that's sort of a relative expression, and the bad ones are all necromancers. So.
okay, yeah, that's definitely a clear distinction. But I guess another thing too, since it's something that you've based into relative history, I guess. What is something that you've created that you're either proud of that you would consider as unique to your world, whether that's like an item or an event or a person?
The one that I like the best is there's a city that's ruled by a panda.
Oh, okay.
It's a city that was founded by Dionysus, so every year they have a drinking contest to decide who the next ruler will be. And the winner of the drinking contest gets to wear the crown of the panda, which turns them into a panda, and also makes them very smart, so they actually know what they're doing when they're a ruler. The panda gets to change one of the laws in the city, so they get to add a law or subtract one. And that law is enforced by a pack of blink dogs that are the police for the city, effectively. And that panda then rules for 1 year, and then they have to give the crown to someone else. But that person stays a panda afterwards. They just no longer have the ruling powers. So there's a bunch of intelligent pandas that are walking around that city.
That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
In my last campaign, one of the players played a retired panda. They were a druid, so it didn't make much of a difference because they were shapeshifting anyways.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Well, damn. Okay. I might have to steal that.
Feel free.